Hello everyone and welcome back to another conversation of the cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today I'm very glad to announce his guest, Milton Shinberg. Milton Shinberg is a veteran architect and professor of architecture with over 40 years teaching at the Catholic University of America School of Architecture and Planning. He has taught cognition-based design for more than 35 years in design studios from freshman level through graduate, and the seminar Beauty and Brains on Architecture and Neuroscience. He is a member of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, ANFA, the advisory board of the International Art and Mind Institute of Johns Hopkins University, and recently was brought on board as faculty for NAD, the Neuroscience Applied to Architectural Design program in Venice. Welcome, Milton. And I know Milton has prepared a wonderful presentation with a strong focus on human-centered design. So go ahead, Milton, and tell us about people.
Here's some people. These are our clients. And this is a whole range of people that we need to be thinking about and designing for. Some of these people have famous faces and some of them don't. Most of the people we work for don't. Just a little anecdote. There's an old friend of mine, architect Mark McIntyre from here, who used to say that he was talking about Frank Schlesinger, who is a wonderful architect and a teacher and a mentor. And he said that anywhere you cut a section through Frank, you find an architect. I think that's true of all of us. Okay. And the other thing that's true of all of us is that we tend to look with curiosity below the surface. And that, I think, is the main Renaissance person quality. And we seek the highest level of synthesis we can achieve. That's our ongoing and highest objective. So many thanks for the invitation. The series is, I think, a great thing. Quinn Evans is to be congratulated for it. I'm not sure that enjoy is exactly the right word for my preparation, since what it actually meant was taking 15 hours of talks from my seminar at Catholic U and boiling them down to less than an hour. Nonetheless, it was a very productive challenge, and I hope you'll find it interesting and a source for ideas that you can actually build on. So this brings me to the thesis of the talk. First and foremost, the process of making architecture, just like the process of putting together this talk, is about audience. Who do we serve, and can we serve them better? How can we improve? Do we really know our audience? Their inner worlds and their realities that connect them to the environments that we design? Do we know that as well as we could? Not only our paying clients, but the people who use what we design and the people who engage with it, what we design, from the community. So my thesis is that we can know much more, and to do that, we'll be helped by the sciences that study behavior and study how we think, which includes my own special interest, as Stephen said, and that's the nexus of neuroscience and architecture, the science of how the brain works. I've always felt that there was something missing in practice and the approach to architecture, and that it was very important. And I almost literally stumbled on some answers about 35 years ago. I'll tell you how that happened. And I knew right away at that moment that I had found something significant, not just for my own design thinking, but also for my colleagues in my firm and for my students. So I'll share some of what I've learned that relates to how the minds of our audience work and how our own minds as designers work as well. So is there a problem? Is there something that we need to address that we're not doing enough of now? And I think there is. But I think the problem is not intention. The problem is bandwidth. We have no choice in our work to be mostly consumed by attention to things rather than people. Whatever bandwidth we bring to work each day is dominated by things and how those things go together. It's also dominated by process and the things that we do that are not design and that are critical to our success as practitioners. So what are things? What do we spend our time thinking about? Well, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about form and systems and parts. These are all things. The guy in the upper right corner there that has the nervous system of his brain connected to the environment, is he really looking at things? Well, I think actually he's feeling as well as thinking, but feeling most. Jan Gehl has a wonderful quote: people ignore design that ignores people. So what I'm going to talk about today is understanding the architecture of things and feeling and how they relate to each other. I want you to keep this in mind. The experience of things is inseparable from emotions. And the more you dig into how we react to architecture, the less we can deny that. So we all do quantitative things. We all deal with square footages, functional relationships. But does this get us to the essence of design? We know it doesn't. Suchi Reddy has a great quote. She says, "I've always said that form follows feeling, not function." That was interesting. So here's an example of some of her work, and you see her touching this wall. Her work is very much about the corporeal experience of architecture. So meet your brain. You've got a left lobe and a right lobe and a connector in the middle. The hippocampus is buried deep within, and the corpus callosum connects them. You don't have to remember anything about those terms, so relax. But we need both right brain, which is the more creative side, to oversimplify, and the left brain, which is the more analytical side, to be successful. So you've got about 100 billion neurons and several trillion connections. It's an enormous capability. And what happened about 40,000 years ago, according to Howard Gardner, is that a less developed pre-human brain was able to do a lot of things efficiently, but separately in modules. And Gardner says at some point, several 100,000 years ago, they started talking to each other in a way that made for an exponential increase in functionality. So where does all this happen? It all happens between your ears. Is there a reality out there? Are we designing for a real reality? Or are we designing for something that's happening inside our head? What we engage in architectural experience is a construct. We can design for that construct. So here, look at this and tell me if you see this static or if it's changing. If it's changing, it's not happening on the screen, it's happening between your ears. Likewise, any changes taking place here? So this is a stand-in for the environment. And the environment is a place where you are where your mind is engaged in this way. So let's talk about architecture and cognition. Cogno, for those who took Latin, just means I know. Recognition is to know something again. So I'm going to check and see if there's some design formulas and cognitive strategies that relate to each other. One of the things we should take pride in as architects is that our intuition and our traditions have elements that now neuroscientists are finding actually are well-based in cognitive process. And one of them is the tripartite scheme. Everybody knows this one. There's a bottom, a middle, and a top. Well, what's that got to do with cognition? Well, this is a building that Louis Sullivan designed, famous one. It has a bottom, a middle, and a top. But if you analyze how people actually relate to it, just in terms of the geometry of vision, you see the bottom straight ahead without cranking your head. That's where we put the detail. It is at eye level. It's the most proximate. To get to the top, we have to tilt our head up. So in terms of what we actually experience, how much are we looking at the tops of buildings? Not nearly as much as we're looking at the bottoms. Here's another thing. Felt elements can organize spaces. This is a picture of a cave that was occupied by humans hundreds of thousands of years ago. And there's a refuge and prospect principle that also has to do with innate intuition. And architects design for it without being explicit. Part of my hope in this talk is that some of these things that are not explicit will become explicit. Here's an example of refuge and prospect. Refuge means that you're safe while you look out and see broadly what's out there, and you can decide whether it's opportunity or it's hazard. So Frank Lloyd Wright designed with refuge and prospect, maybe not in mind, but indeed. If you look at falling water in the horizontal strip windows, that allows your head to rotate as it likes to on your neck and see the broad horizon, not the horizon in that case, but to see broadly around the building from a position that's high up, which means there's refuge and prospect. And then his prairie houses all have strip windows, again, to scan the horizon. The prairie had been a dangerous place. This kind of arrangement of windows was a response to that. Refuge and prospect, we're familiar with this one. Lifted up, strip windows. Okay. Sorry, there's a duplicate. Now, sometimes we like glass houses, sometimes we don't. The question is, do they work? Well, there's lots of prospect, but there's no refuge. And that's the reason that people never felt comfortable living in them, and they have been preserved but not used. So we're going to talk about something called affect, which means feeling. That's all it means. Affective architecture is something that engages our feelings, and it can be pursued in a systematic way, and I'll be showing some examples of that. So to contrast, traditional design process, what we all learned in school and what we tend to do, starts with an orientation to develop form. We want to get there. We like to get there pretty fast, actually, and my argument is we get there too fast. But there's something that is maybe not opposite, but it's something that can run parallel, and I'm calling that affective design processes. And they start with how the spaces and settings should feel, which means we have to decide before we make form how they should feel. And you don't have to choose between these two methods. You can do both. They'll reinforce each other. And the nice thing about your brain, according to Howard Gardner, and your experience, I'm sure, is that your brain will do the synthesizing quite nicely. We can take a lot of input as architects and synthesize it. So, uncovering and evolving a nexus between affect and architecture, here's how that developed. I was asked to teach the freshman studio back in 1982, and what I discovered was that it was expected of me that I would incorporate basic design exercises like these, black and white with equal weight, two-dimensional, called figure ground exercises. I did these when I was in college, and I don't know whether they made sense to me then, but I don't recall them having any impact on me in my development. It was graphically interesting, but it doesn't connect to three-dimensional reality. So here's the Bauhaus. They thought that one course could serve all of the visual arts, including architecture. Didn't feel right to me, so I wouldn't do that when I was starting to teach this course. I decided that instead of doing two-dimensional, I would find ways to do three-dimensional exercises that still addressed figure and ground. And the way I came across this was they stumble at an old bookstore in DC with E.H. Gombrich's Art and Illusion. And as soon as I read this, I realized that there was a terrific door opening to understanding how brains and art relate to each other, and from that, how brains and architecture relate to each other. So the next guy was Rudolf Arnheim, Art and Visual Perception, Visual Thinking, and most importantly, the Dynamics of Architectural Form, which is a hard book to plow through, but if anybody's taking notes, I really encourage you to try that out. So I thought the exercises needed to be more spatial, like architecture. So I had them do series of planes, layered views, in which they explored depth cues. And they looked at these as black and white. We looked at figure and ground. We looked at the depth cues. And through this process, they very quickly developed a command of three-dimensionality. This was the box project, series of plexiglass layers, and they put things in. And we analyzed what the visual cues were that created depth perception. Another book, Origins of Architectural Pleasure, connects evolution and mind in architectural experience, also a book I would highly recommend to you. And the Dynamics of Delight. There are ways of connecting architectural aesthetics to cognition. Another subject that I want to mention is embodiment. Embodiment just means that we feel kinesthetically through movement where we are in space, what we touch, how we move, and that is recorded in our body. I would argue, and I'm not alone in this, that architecture is very much an embodied experience that involves forces that are compositional, that are symmetrical or asymmetric. And here's a wonderful book, Body, Memory, and Architecture by Kent Bloomer and Charles Moore, that says, architecture, to the extent that it is considered an art, is characterized in its design stages as an abstract visual art and not as a body-centered art. We believe that the most essential and memorable sense of three-dimensionality originates in the body experience, and that this sense may constitute a basis for understanding spatial feeling in our experience of buildings. I vote for that. So there are neuroscientists who are studying art and music and architecture, so this is not beyond the realm of scientific investigation. In fact, it's quite a popular ongoing thing right now for them. Anjan Chatterjee, Buildings, Beauty and the Brain, a Neuroscience of Architectural Experience. I will get these YouTube postings to Carolina for sharing. There are some references here. How Your Brain Decides What's Beautiful, a great TED Talk. And the Neuroscience of Aesthetics of Art, in which he comes up with 8 laws he believes are necessary to art being effective. Pretty interesting, and he makes a good case. Michael Arbib, he's a neuroscientist, but he loves working with architects, and he has this article, From Frogs' Brains to the Drawing of Buildings. So as a practitioner, what I wanted was not to hear just theories, but evidence-based design. And the problem is that it's easy to know what a cannonball does and how it hits the ground and how long it takes relative to its weight, because it's a single factor analysis. But architectural experience is a rich array of factors. Just imagine being in New York, being in Manhattan at 56th and Park, and the onslaught of that experience. How do you break that apart? Well, there are pieces to the puzzle that have been broken apart. The Heshong group, Home group rather, has done several studies that have been replicated that correlates the size of windows with performance on standardized testing, which shows 15 to 20% increases in standardized test scores for students who are in rooms that have not adequate light, but a lot of light. Okay. More natural light promotes healing. There's a study of hospitals in which people were able to be discharged an average of 1 day sooner when there were windows with views. Another one, among patients hospitalized for depression, those in rooms facing southeast, which received the most light, were discharged an average of 30 days earlier than those in rooms facing northwest. Ocean Vartanian did a study on the neuroscience of creativity, but more interestingly, he found in another study exploring individual differences in preference for curved versus angular objects, that people don't like sharp points and 90-degree corners as much as they like curves. I think that's clearly anthropomorphic, that we evolved with curved forms, we didn't evolve with 90-degree angles. So artists have made discoveries that preceded science. Leonardo on the far right, on the upper right, certainly did. But there are lots of books. There's one called Proust Was a Neuroscientist that shows the anticipation of discoveries that happen 50 or 100 years later. But architects, not so much. This is not an area where we have delved very much, but these folks have. So just a quick calendar of my engagement. I taught the freshman course from 83 to 93. And at that time, when I was teaching this, I knew of nobody else who was looking at architectural neuroscience other than Arnheim. 2004 to 2020, a beauty and brain seminar, which is very popular at Catholic U, and from which this talk is compressed. And then we had a house for a blind composer where all the senses were available for design except vision. I'll talk about ANFA in a minute, been engaged with them. That's architects and neuroscientists talking with each other. I've given a talk on the subject to the National Academy of Sciences and to AIADC, to National AIA in Orlando. 350 architects showed up at 7 a.m., so there's some interest here. And 2018, Virginia AIA, and now I'm on faculty and with a school in Venice. So some of the firms are actually devoting energy and resources to this. And Smith Group is even using it for advertising. Take note. And the AIA as well, BRIC, is an organization that's been created to do research. And here's one of the topics on mood and aesthetic experience in architecture. This stuff can be studied, shared, and you can build it into how you think about design. The late, great John Eberhard took a grant from the AIA, the Latrobe Prize, and founded ANFA, the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, out at Salk. I've attended some of their sessions, and they're making progress on finding answers that are cognitively based and relate to architectural thinking and what people respond to. So cognition, I know. Resolution means that your brain goes through a process of resolving and knowing what it's looking at. Cognitive closure is another name for the same thing. It's when you complete the process of perception and cognition to know what's out there. So here's an example, audience participation. I want you to prepare to slap the table that's in front of you in this pattern. Can you do that? That's the answer. So cognitively, this is a setup, and your mind can't help but do that to reach the aha point. That's cognitive closure. The speed of closure is also something that's important. It takes between 0.4 and 0.75 seconds, generally, to reach cognitive closure, which is actually pretty slow. The speed of closure, though, is a critical survival mechanism. You have to identify the figure, you have to judge the situation, and you have to take action, which could be fight or flight. So let's talk about the sequence of experience, not just the speed. The sequence is sensation. That's your senses. You've got 5 of them. They all involve architecture. Even the smell of concrete is an architectural sense. Perception is the initial processing. It's really about shape identification, not about what it is, but what the shape of it is. And you've got cells in your retina that just look at vertical lines and lines at 30 degrees, etc. Cognition is object identification, and that's all valuable only if it leads to action. So that takes about 0.6 to 0.8 seconds. But then you repeat it. How many times? If you're awake for 17 hours, which is less than most architects, that's over 70,000 times a day that you repeat this cycle. And we're looking at much more than architecture. Our bandwidth is not so much about architecture. So it's very brief. Sorry about that. So let's look at some examples of the speed of architectural closure. You're going to be the judge of whether it's fast or slow, but also the question is, should we control it? Should we try to get people to look at different kinds of buildings in different ways? So this is a more dynamic form. Are you reaching cognitive closure more or less quickly than this one? And by cognitive closure, I mean understanding the dominant forms spatially. Or this one. How quickly? Or this one, which is more static. So symmetrical architecture, classical architecture, tends to be faster in reaching closure than asymmetric architecture, which has tensions built into it, which involve figures. Here we're looking at 2 figures dancing, competing with each other for your attention. Or in this case, where there are 3 figures in this composition. And that slows down closure. Well, in art, that's a good thing. You don't want people to go through a gallery and pass by each painting. Each one is just the snap of a finger. Artistic tension is the intentional process of getting people to slow down. This one is pretty simple. There's not much slowing down. We work so hard on buildings, and yet they're cognitively easily dismissed. Unless they're aggressive, that doesn't mean we like them. We might, but there's lots of figures and lots of tension. And in this case, there's additional tension because there are aspects of symmetry and aspects of asymmetry. So think about how that should be aligned with project purpose and intent. So let's try a definition. I'm kind of going to reduce things to this. A definition of architecture: spatial compositions that accelerate or retard the cognitive passage toward closure. It's a manipulation. Music: temporal compositions that accelerate or retard the cognitive passage toward closure. Every style of music is a different organization of speed of closure, tempo, resolution, creation of tension and resolution. Painting: two-dimensional compositions that accelerate or retard the cognitive passage toward closure. So in all of the arts, manipulating the receivers, the viewers, the engaged people by creating artistic tension that is making it harder to reach closure is part of what we do on purpose. So there needs to be a vocabulary, a cognitive vocabulary for both experiencing and analyzing, but also designing architecture. And I'm just going to go through a brief listing or an initial listing of this. The first word you need to know is saccade. Look at the eyes. When we look at when we look at faces, we engage a lot of our brain because knowing what people are about is very important to our safety in evolutionary terms. Or knowing if that's a bear out in the distance. Look at all the tracking that's shown in those wiggly lines to try to figure out what's out there. And the more complicated or ambiguous it is, the longer it takes. Really long cognitive delay is dangerous. So face recognition and penetrating ambiguity and pattern recognition are all things we're hardwired for. They are the core of knowing cognitive process, and it's something that you're born with. So here we have some eyes. And I'm going to talk about how the vision is organized. It's not so important here that it's binocular, although it is. It's more important that there's a cone of vision for each eye. So here's something that might be familiar to you. Capturing the scene. This is called cognitive scanning of the environment, where your eyes usually, for most people, start to the left, scan to the right, continue to scan. There's also cognitive zooming, because the brain is interested in knowing something. It doesn't care whether it's big or small in the field of vision. It only cares about identification. So here in Berlin, there's cognitive zooming to see what's on top. So some simple but dominant perceptual cues are value, contour, silhouette, layering or overlap, and figure ground. Briefly, value, just the difference between light and dark, we all know that. It arrives first in terms of cognitive things that infants can do. They don't initially see color. The optic nerve hasn't been myelinated early on. But there are infant stim modules that are put over cribs because black and white is more easily perceived and it gains the attention. But also, color is what leaves first, and black and white is what departs last. If you're a pilot at high G and you black out, pilots report color vision goes out and we go back to the base, which is black and white. And that's one of the reasons that architecture mostly is monochromatic, because to see things in space, to understand form, value is actually the primary definer. Contour is just the edge between two values, but it makes for silhouette, and silhouette's a very potent cue. It's used in wars for people who are looking out to see whether it's an aircraft carrier or a battleship or a mine layer. It's the silhouette that is highly recognizable. Your brain is set up for value and for pattern recognition. And that's how we recognize cities. It's high and fast recognition. It's also very memorable. So what's layering? Layering is something that interferes with seeing the figure. It takes more cognitive time. It's harder to identify the figure, and it creates the potential for richer architectural experience because our brain wants to reach closure, so it wants to know what's on the other side. Ambiguity is rich in architecture because of layering, and it's another way to achieve an intriguing result because there's an incomplete figure. Gestalt is the complete figure. Layering interrupts or interferes with gestalt. So here's an example of layering in architecture that's a familiar one. AIA Awards, show us your best work. Here's layering. It's rich, it's dynamic, and it's saccade-inducing. Figure ground, the core of spatial understanding. It's very simple. Figure is the thing that is standing out. Ground is what's behind it. Figure tends to be discontinuous. Ground tends to be continuous. So here's continuous. This is a ground. How do you create a figure? You knock one over. Very simple. Your brain attends to the thing which is different. Le Corbusier used it, created a ground by repetition, and to create the entrance, broke the pattern. That's figure. What breaks the pattern is figure. What breaks the pattern is figure. So figure recognition in architecture is a legacy process. It wasn't invented for architecture. We didn't suddenly enter the world of architecture 7,000 years ago and have new capacities. These are legacy processes from evolution. And figure recognition in architecture, like all the other perceptual mechanisms, is a legacy process. Here we have one of our ancestors who is totally recognizable today. And that ancestor, looking out into the woods, saw information, but it wasn't always complete information to know whether that was a wolf, a foe, or a dog who was your friend. So cognitive process and speed are evolutionarily driven, and they are captured by architecture. Movement is one of the most important cues. Figures move. Architecture isn't static. So why not design the movement or the choreography of people experiencing it? Why aren't we typically making storyboards to track not just the sequence of things that have been built or cities that we know, but what we want to have happen? So choreography helps. It's a matter of planning. We can use it for planning. We can induce movement. We're all familiar with the Barcelona Pavilion, highly asymmetric and highly intentional. Here's some tracking of how people move through the Barcelona Pavilion. This is planned choreography. I just wanted to show this briefly. I'm involved with some people at ANFA and SOC, and we're right now preparing a choreographed event in the main space. And this is one of the ways that we're plotting it out. It'll show both the neuroscience of experience, but also the spatial and architectural size of things. So let's take a slightly different tack. Everybody thinks beauty is a dangerous subject. It is, but I'm going to go after it. So what makes beauty? So here's a quiz. This is what is going to be launched now by Carolina. And what I want you to do in this poll is look at the next 9 examples and vote for each one independently. It's not ranking them all one against the other. It's just each one. And this is a gut reaction. If you like something and you think it's fantastic, that's a 10. If you don't like it, you can give it a 1. So let's get into it. I hope you're all ready. I'll give you just a minute or a few seconds.
So I've dropped the link to the form on the chat for everybody, for anyone who's looking for it.
Oh, and by the way, I also want to thank the people who have posted questions for neuroscientists to Miro, and I will be translating them into a form that can go to ANFA to get the neuroscientists to study what we want them to study. So here's 3. Take a moment for voting, score for A, B, and C, and do it very quickly, just gut. Oops, I got to repeat here, sorry. You can vote twice for that. D, E, and F. G, H, and I. All right, that's your test. That's the only test today. So the question about beauty in architecture, is it cognitive? Is it just something that is taste? Is it something that that everybody can disagree about? Well, perhaps there's some underlying things. And there are some theories. Phi, the golden ratio, is a theory about beauty, which has been applied to things like the Venus de Milo and seems to work with things like chambered nautilus and works with the Fibonacci series. And it's been applied, and it is thought to have been part of the origination of the Parthenon. Well, other people have gotten into the act. Le Corbusier did. He had Modular Man. And speaking of Renaissance men, here's Vitruvian Man. All based on the notion that math or numbers can be used as a hard basis for design, and that is precise. Vitruvius had some theories about beauty. He thought it was involved with what we all know and heard so many times, commodity, firmness, and delight being beauty. Alberti also had some theories, as did Palladio, and I've got some heavy books on my side table about theories of beauty. There are lots of them. But when we look at applying this particular phi, golden section, to other buildings, it doesn't quite apply in the same way as a static organizer. So what's going on? Is there a biological theory of beauty that is more universal than the golden section? Well, maybe it has to do with vision. So here we have our friend the Mona Lisa, and what I'm showing you is her looking at the Parthenon through the cone of vision of two eyes, and those two circles overlap because that's what happens. Imagine those are glasses. And superimposing that on a skull, what goes across her eyes, of course, is the horizon line. But if you inscribe the cone of vision of two eyes into a rectangle, voila, guess what you get? You get the golden section. And there it is on the right, transition it across to the left. Is it constant or does it vary? Well, it does vary. It's not, everybody's head is a little bit different, your eye spacing is a little bit different, but in general, it works. And when things fit into that section, that golden section, which is really the overlap of the cone of vision of two eyes, you get greater cognitive speed of closure because it fits the equipment. It fits. And relief is rewarded with endorphins. When you go from a situation of not knowing to a situation of knowing, you get a reward. One of the things that was done in World War II is to test out what turned out to be something that agreed with the golden section, and that was the design of periscopes. The proportion of that for long periods on watch turned out to be the golden section, as is 35 millimeter film. So let's talk about ugly and physiology. I'll define ugly as experiences that increase the limbic system's negative response. Well, what's the limbic system? That's deep inside the brain. It's the ancient brain, the visual, the cortex of the brain grew up over it as we evolved. And it is all about emotion, fear, discomfort, even panic. Those are in the limbic system, but the limbic system also has pleasure. But let's stick with ugly for a minute. Here are some scenes that I think are ugly. You may think they're ugly. I expect that you don't think they're beautiful. And one of the reasons is that you can't easily see threats in time to react to them. There are places to hide. And there are many figures, and then they don't coalesce into an identification that's clear. So it's dangerous. These arouse deep-seated, hardwired survival responses. Cortisol is expressed. The hormone of fear. It helps our heart rate increase, our running faster, our reaction times quicker. Let's look at beauty and physiology. Obviously, this is very brief, but there is some evidence that experiences that increase the limbic system's hormonal pleasure response are what we experience as beauty. It's been measured. When people are shown images of beautiful things, parts of the brain that are activated involve pleasure areas. And here are some of the things that endorphins are associated with: sex and food, insight and discovery, because that is a valuable part of survival and of evolution. Verdant settings that are green, hospitable, have food, protection, relaxation, some art and music, some architecture. So that's the limbic system. It puts out all these hormones for food, for sex, and for environments that sustain us with water and green things. So on one side, you get endorphins. On the other side, you get cortisol. Look at all the things that go along with beauty. Blood pressure's down, focus increases, more relaxation, more energy, more serenity, and empathy. On the other hand, cortisol and blood pressure coming up, increased heart risk, disruption, stress, fatigue, irritability, and conflict. Those are the feelings that go along with the experience of ugly, so I argue. Now, here's an example. I did a couple of drawings of the Lincoln Memorial, one from the sunny side in the morning, east facade, and it's very much easier to read the detail because of the shadow, because of the the figure and ground defined by value, than it is on the back side. I'm calling it the back. It's the west facade in morning shade. I would say that the view from the east is more beautiful than the view from the west. And here we have rainy brain, sunny brain. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down. I think because we are in need of cognitive clarity for survival, and that means defining things with light and dark, rainy days make it harder to identify figure. They're not cognitively friendly. Vignelli has a nice quote, "The life of a designer is one of fight against the ugliness." So what about approaches that are accessible to us as architects that are less aimed at form? And I'm going to categorize that as qualitative pre-design. We all do pre-design. We also do quantitative pre-design. We're used to doing that. And most of us also do qualitative pre-design, which is looking at the non-numerical things. But I'd like to be a little more specific about them. We all have done charrettes. We want to get input from people who are not architects, who have concerns. It's very easy for us to not hear them well. It's very important for us to ask questions. So I call it multi-round charrettes, where you go back to them later on and talk. So invite and don't interrupt. Ask questions afterwards about what they mean. Here's a system that I've used for a long time. I show them pictures of a building that may or may not be the same building type as the one that's the subject. And then I say, mark it up. Everybody gets green dots, red dots, yellow dots. And they are to put them on and make comments to help me understand. And then I spend some time with them debriefing them afterwards. So they will do 5 or 10 of these images. And when we're done, we have a sense of what it is they want. And it's not a literal style that we're looking for, it's the qualities. Pinterest works great for the same thing. I use this with clients. I took a client who was interested in having a prefab Victorian building in Missouri, and we ended up with something bright, open, glassy, and totally to their liking. As we compared notes, we ended up going far away from what they first thought they wanted. So what else can we do? We can invite words, narrative. Words have an amazing capability to give us traction and really understand the emotional and limbic connection to architectural experience. Scenarios, write about what it would be like to go into the building that you're designing, to use it. Write those things out. Invite free association from the users. Collect the words. Invite free association, and then go back to the office and build on those words, and then go back to the participants to see if you got it right. I guarantee that you won't get it all right. I always tell my clients, I'm not going to get it all right. You're going to correct me. Okay. So invite poetry. It's a deeper way to use words to connect with emotion and imagery. What are the words and what is the story in Nighthawk? What are the qualities? What is this about architecturally? What are the words and what is the story here? And how can this be translated into an architectural setting? You need to understand your audience. That's my main message. So put yourselves in the shoes of the users and whoever will experience what you want to create. It's obviously not just the paying client. And then the other thing I want to emphasize is what I call question hunting. Pena, who's a great programmer from CRS, wrote a book called Problem Seeking. And I think that's part of what we need to do more. So here's an example. I was designing a school for highly distractible students, and they told me that they wanted to have, the teacher said, we wish we had bay windows in the classrooms, but the building did not have bay windows. They wanted something they associated with this. They liked pictures of bay windows. So I tried to probe it because we had a building that didn't allow for that. The classrooms were rectangular, they had lots of windows. But when I asked them again and again and again why they wanted a bay window, it was because a bay window gave a place for a student who was worn out by the educational process to go and rest and recoup. So we didn't have a bay. So instead of that, a fairly simple device, this was a very inexpensive project, they didn't have much money, but we wanted them to be effective, was to just take things in the room and rotate them enough to create spaces in the corners. So the lighting all followed the parallelogram, and the flooring followed the parallelogram, and then 2 little sitting areas with soft pillows and residential lamps were made in the room, and that turned out to work beautifully. The experience of every student and every teacher that mattered most. This was the core. This was the most important thing we could do for these students. Another thing we did was we found an approach to color. They felt that all the colors should be like the top band here, very soft, not exciting. These students needed calm. But I said, well, what about using more color in different areas? So here's what we did. The stairwells in this vertical building were hot colors or intense colors, saturated. The corridors were medium, and the classrooms were soft and more monochromatic. It was the transition emotionally of going into the classrooms that got them to the point that they would exhale and be able to engage. And there are plenty of other approaches. I'll just outline a couple. One of them is designing architectural movement, as I mentioned earlier, but to do it through thumbnails and storyboards. It's done in movies all the time. Why don't we do it in architecture? We can. Thumbnail sketches don't presume a formal prejudice in advance. They're just ways of basically brain dumping what you have in your head, but you need to externalize before you try to come up with a complete solution. Basic principle that I advocate is not to let the pencil touch the drawing surface or the computer, the mouse, until you've done these preliminary things. Let them cook in your brain. Next step is creating an affective or an emotional agenda to integrate the qualitative needs into architectural design. There are ways of doing that in a systematic manner. And how do you do them? Well, there's a qualitative language for architecture that can document the feelings of the spaces and the places that you wish to have accomplished, that you wish to achieve. They're words. We all use these words, but we don't do them as a disciplined process, but could with our clients and with ourselves. Warm, safe, energizing, relaxing, natural. This is a scenario. Climbing stairs, my fright is seen with the bumps on my skin, anticipating the light switch, distant, many steps within, as I dash through the door, etc. Gives you the feeling. So there are lots of words like this that convey character and feelings. What if you were to record them? Use lots of adjectives, not so much nouns, because those are about things, not about feelings. What if you record them and you track them all the way through the project, from concept all the way through? And by doing so, you invite emotion and imagery to your design process. I argue that it's a short path. It seems like something extra to do, but I argue that it's a very short path to excellent architecture, not a detour. Because I think we jump too quickly from the measurable, like square footage and frontal lobe-based analysis, to partie and form making. Why not start with character, with gesture, with image? Calatrava starts with figures of bodies. He draws the bodily form before he draws anything in terms of building. He doesn't start with structure. Alto, drawings that convey great sense of feeling and empathy. Gary, you get the idea. This was not the final form, but he had expressed quite a lot. Okay, or Liebskind. These are not forms yet. Okay, and I think you can take that into an affective checklist in which you say, I want the building to accomplish the following emotionally for the people who enter it. You can use words and phrases, images and poetry. And then be watchful as you design. You keep those words and those images alive from pre-design all the way through construction documents. So here's what I'm asking you to consider, that form-based design and affective cognitive experiential design can be seen as mutually supportive processes to help your mind achieve a creative synthesis, feeling and thinking before drawing. And as you've probably heard this a number of times, but I'll read it anyway because it's a great quote from Kahn. A great building must begin with the immeasurable, must go through measurable means when it is being designed, and in the end, must be unmeasured. starting with feeling and ending with feeling, aligned with empathy toward those who engage with what we create. So we have almost reached 5 o'clock. I don't know if there's a time for questions, but I'm willing to stick around longer if anyone would like to have some discussion. And I think I will see if I can figure out with this program how to disengage.
Milton, thank you very much on behalf of Quinn Evans. That was quite thought-provoking. And yeah, we can stay a few more minutes for questions. If anyone, please just speak up.
Milton, all right if I make a comment?
Please do.
Fred Marks.
Hi.
Hi. Former president of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, so I'm extremely happy that you're addressing our architectural audience on the East Coast, and I always learn something from you, so I hope the same was true of the rest of the audience. Just to make a point, architecture is about experience, and therefore the more that we understand about human behavior, the more we'll be able to complement the experience that the occupants will have. We do most of the time a very good job in working intuitively, but why go blindly? So if we can learn more about how people feel and react to the things that we include in our design, the better off we're going to be in the future. So thank you for making the points that you have.
Thank you, Fred. That's a great summary. By the way, Fred and I have had lots of conversations about this. We've had lots of conversations with neuroscientists who are engaged with the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And Fred is one of the people that we're working right now with on trying to do choreography in the SOC main space for the next ANFA conference. And so that's a work in progress. We have a lot of hopes for that. Other questions or comments?
Hi, Milton. Thalia here. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I was you kind of explained how you got into this, but I was wondering, have you had opportunities at Catholic to do like interdisciplinary research with scientists that do study these things?
Catholic University is not a very ripe place for that, unfortunately. So the answer is not there, but there have been cross arts collaborations there. The head of composition in the music school was the collaborator for the House for a Blind Composer, and he supplied 6 graduate students, each of which represented a composer. We blinded all of them, and we blinded Beethoven, so now he's deaf and blind, and designed houses for them, which were quite amazing what the students came up with in this 4th-year studio. That could be experienced, changes of level, changes of the heat that came through windows rather than the view from the windows, textures, changes of direction, just really an amazing thing. And we collaborated on that, and then I went to his class and gave him architectural settings, and his students composed from that.
Great, thanks.
Hey Milton, this is Andrea. I have a question for you. I wonder how this basic reaction to visual reaction or perceptions, etc., are or are not, maybe in your opinion, influenced by the culture or a personal, or growth or experience? How does that play?
Well, that's the old nature and nurture question. And the first part of the answer I would give you is that nature is the dominant. The culture builds on top of that. And so you would expect, if that's true, to see commonality in reactions across cultures. And although the differences are what stand out to us, it's the commonalities that really do exist. And there have been a number of studies, for example, of landscape paintings to see how people respond to those and which ones they like. And it turns out they like a very narrow range of landscape paintings. What they seem to like are the ones that have refuge and prospect, that have green and verdant environments and have water and sunny days so that you can see what's happening with lots of shadows. That's a pretty narrow range of landscape paintings, but cross-culturally and over different age groups, this has been studied multiple times. And it's I think, a good indicator right there. I think it is very useful to want to study how different people in different cultures react. There may be a gentleman on this call right now, Julio Bermudez, who's my colleague at Catholic University, who has done neuroscience experiments with fMRIs on how people experience images. And I don't know, Julio, if you are on, maybe you can answer the question about whether you think this is more dominant as a kindred thing among people or that there are more cultural variations. Julio, are you there? Don't think we have him. So that's an interesting question, and Julio and I will pick that up. But I think based on the readings that I've done, there's more commonality than there is difference.
That seems to be the same for me, but I was just curious. But thank you very much. It was really, really great presentation. Thank you, Mr. for sharing.
Thank you.
Hi, Milton. Good evening from Stuttgart. Thanks for a great presentation. It was very comprehensive and also really inspiring in many ways. I really found very interesting how you brought, for example, the use of storyboards as something that we can use actively as a tool to organize or think how we can work with movement as something that we also design. And as you know, I'm also very interested in this topic. But I have a bit of a challenging question for you.
Please.
Because you came to this part in your talk where you were discussing the issue of beauty and also of ugliness. And the colleague before just mentioned this question of that there is always different cultural perspectives to how we perceive things, although we can always see patterns which tend to be appreciated as beauty or ugly among different cultures. But my question is, if we look at art history and how, for example, we had movements that intentionally brought a rupture of a particular style or a particular aesthetic, and they were always perceived in the beginning as ugly. For example, Cubism or action art or arte povera, and then became accepted as beautiful. So how can we transport this from this neuroaesthetics perspective?
Well, in the book, Proust Was a Neuroscientist, there's a wonderful account of the premiere of The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky in Paris. And when it was first performed, according to reports, people got up from their seats and ran out of the opera house, some screaming. They couldn't make sense of it. And then the answer was that there was cognitive dissonance, which means that their brains could not handle, they didn't have a basis in their experience for processing this. But over time, that didn't stay that same way. It changed. People did develop ways of doing it. So it can be very disruptive. But if the basic ingredients are accessible and we can learn to make adjustments so that we are receptive to them, then things will happen, things will change. I think that the change in art is really a dramatic and important part of what we do as architects too. The creation of the modern movement was dramatic, and in doing so created a lot of counter reaction, which was dramatic, and that debate continues today. Although what is modernism has changed and what is classical or traditional has changed in ways as well. Nonetheless, those are really, it's a kind of a culture battle that goes on and continues from something that was going on in the late 1890s through about 1920.
Thank you.
Okay, Maria.
Hey, Milton, this is Julia. Great presentation, super fascinating. I had a question for you related to kind of post-occupancy evaluation, and if there's things that you think should be kind of more common in the way that we're following up with our projects as ways to validate or better understand the reactions of the occupants to the design decisions?
I think post-occupancy evaluations are a terrific opportunity to find out if what we think we're doing is what we're doing. In several different ways. Obviously, we don't know the emotional reaction of people, but people move in and out of buildings over time, and we get a chance to find out young people versus old people versus how they feel in 2021 versus 2031. We will learn a lot from post-occupancy evaluations, and that we don't do it consistently is really, I think, a terrible disservice to the public, that we don't have the chance to learn from that. We learn about whether the carpets wear out. We learn about whether the mechanical systems stay at their correct level. But what we don't learn is whether our design intentions have been met with empathically, whether we have gotten it, whether we figured it out, and whether we designed correctly for it. So yeah, I think it's a terrifically underutilized part of what we do. One of the problems is, how do you test what's going on? And the art of surveying, the art of researching is a very delicate process, but it's something that we don't do enough and we need to do more of. There have been experiments of taking people around to look at facades to see how people react to them. They put galvanic, lie detector sensors on their wrists, and they measure heart rate going down the street, and everybody's asked to look at the same thing at the same time. And these are timed recordings that they can go back and correlate how people react to different facades. So there are ways of measuring and recording people's reactions that they can't articulate in words, but are definitely felt deeply. So that's another form of it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Just like the different strategies for successfully getting at good feedback and figuring out how to do that in a way that's consistent. And I think there's a lot that we could be better at learning how to do that.
I've made an important part of my career the pre-design portion and running charrettes in a way that is the most inviting for people. And part of that is really to say at the outset, I expect to get it wrong. I expect to only get it right after I come back and tell you what I thought I heard, and now you tell me what you were really trying to explain to me. I think there's a humility in that. For us to assume that what we feel about something is the same as what other people will feel about it, I think isn't true, isn't reliable, but it also isn't fair. And one of the things that I think architects do, that artists do, that's different from the rest of the world is that we get those hormone expressions of oxytocin and the other pleasure hormones when we design, when we feel good about what we're doing. You know the feeling when you're designing and it's frustrating and it's not going well, and then suddenly the light comes on and you find yourself doing that, finding your way to a solution. That process of tension and relief carries with it a lot of pleasure. But the things that we find pleasurable in terms of form and form making may not align with what the rest of the world likes. Should we be just doing what's popular? No, we are advocates as well. But we need to know more. We need to know if there are differences between what we project as being good and beautiful and useful and what the people who use our buildings feel. That would also get at the cross-cultural part. So there's a lot of research, and a lot of this research is going on. Fred knows about some of this, and there's a lot of stuff that is developing and reportable. Eve Edelstein is a wonderful researcher in this area, and she and I are collaborating on taking some of your answers to the questions, what would you like neuroscientists to study, to combine that with a survey I did during the Virginia Architecture Conference a few years ago. And we're going to organize that and then share that with ANFA and see if we can get some traction with neuroscientists.
Milton, Bill Bonstra, nice job. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, I'm reminded that you said a few things about being familiar, and then with music or with art and that sort of thing. And we latch on to what we understand, we've seen before maybe, and that we like it. Sometimes in music, you have to listen and listen and listen and listen, and then it becomes more familiar and you like it.
Right.
Raymond Loewy's Maya theory of design, which is about technology, but I think it's also about this beauty, most advanced yet acceptable. when you push the limits too far, you the ugly light goes on because you don't know how to handle it. But if you bring people along incrementally, that is a great way to create familiarity and acceptance. And it reminds me when I work with Shalom Baranis, we used to put sketches up on the wall and leave them there for days, and then people would see them, and then you'd have an easier time maybe suggesting this is a great solution because they then became familiar. So I kind of tie that together in how we design and how the acceptance of what we do. If we go too far, sometimes it can be seen as ugly.
Yeah, there's always the cutting edge, the avant-garde, and then you're right, between that and what is conventional, there's a lot of range. Mark Ferguson, who's the dean at Catholic, likes to point out that evolution is more comfortable than revolution. And I think that's the same point that you're making. I think the incremental thing works. I also want to mention that as a watercolorist, that same process works internally just for me. I'll take something that I've painted but not finished and purposely put it aside for a day or a week or a month, look at it occasionally, and then put it back on the wall and then really get a much better sense of what it is. So there's evolution that takes place in the design process as well as in the ability of people to absorb a change in ideas, a change in paradigm.
Yeah.
I can also mention that when I was starting to listen to avant-garde music, it was music that everybody hated, except perhaps the composer and a few people who claimed that they didn't hate it. What I found was that I didn't have to like it, but it turned out that I was able to like it after a time if I stopped assuming that it was music. Instead, I thought about it just as sounds. Right? And then the sounds had meaning. There's a way of getting at what I would call the abstraction underneath the organized reality. If you break it down and you just attend to with your mind, you just focus on aspects rather than your preconception about what music is supposed to be or what architecture is supposed to be or performance art is supposed to be.
That's right. That's right. No, I'm 100%. I use the White Stripes as an example. It took me a while, but I really love them as a group, and they're all about sort of discordance and arrhythmia and things like that I didn't think I liked, but I actually do.
Right. It's rich. It's rich. It's a question of how much richness your brain is ready to receive. And it's in part it's tolerance for it, but then it's pleasure in it.
Yeah, it's great.
The pleasure of discovery, the pleasure of learning is part of it's an evolutionary drive. The people in ancient tribes who were able to solve problems were highly prized because they were directly able to, fashion an arrowhead or, find a way to do something that helped the group preserve and advance its life. So we get pleasure out of that. These are all hardwired things. They're in us.
Hey, Milton, it's Barry.
Hello, Barry.
Fascinating discussion. This idea of evolution and growth. I mean, obviously, you grow, and when you stop growing, you die. I mean, that's not a unique thought. That's been said many times. But something that struck me in the comments made a few people ago was about post-occupancy evaluation. What's the post part of it? It's post-construction, but occupancy goes on for decades.
Right.
We act as if occupancy is a one-time deal. It happens and then it's over. And it really makes sense to go back over and over again to a building, look at it over time, look at how it's changed. One of the most amazing things I saw was Le Corbusier's worker housing in Passac in the Bordeaux area. I was there in 1982, I guess, and you could barely recognize it because of all the awnings people had put on and just transformations they had made. Some you might say were tacky and others were tasteful, but clearly it was a different place than Corbu had thought he was designing.
Right.
And it's, you know, just because occupancy is a long-term enterprise.
Maybe we should say pre-design and post-design.
Well, hopefully you're still designing in post-design.
We are too, right?
Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
So there seem to be no further questions, so we can end our session for now. Thank you very much, Milton, for accepting this invitation, and we will see us all next week for another conversation. Bye-bye.